Alrighty. Thank you, everybody. Welcome. This is just a little event we're putting together to think about the meaning, legacy, the future of the American Revolution, given that it's the 250th anniversary. I want to thank our intrepid panelists for the 10 a.m. start time. We will have several panels throughout the day. This first panel is opening up with the question of liberalism and to what degree the American Revolution is liberal and what does that mean. We will then have a bit of a break and we're going to have somebody come and read George Washington's Ulysses around noon while we all just kind of hang out. And then our second panel will be on the Republic. How has the American Republic endured these through America's global role, the rise of the administrative state, etc. And then at our final panel for this portion will be on 1776 and the Constitution. So after that we will have tacos. And then Platypus will be having a panel on what is revolutionary about the American Revolution, and then we'll have a film at the end. So everybody's welcome to stay the whole day. I know it's a bit of a marathon, but without further ado, so the question for this panel, and the way it's going to work is each speaker is going to give about 10 minutes for opening remarks. Then they will respond to each other at will, and then we're going to open it up for y'all's questions to the panelists. So the question is the American Revolution liberal, and if so, how? What is liberalism? What is the difference between classical and progressive liberalism? In what sense did liberalism inform the founding and Constitution? Where does liberalism stand today? So we have James Vaughn. He's a UChicago historian of the British Empire in the 18th century. We have Erin Hagood. She's a doctoral student at Columbia and the president of Platypus. We have Stephen, who teaches philosophy and curates the Cracks in Postmodernity Substack. We have Kelley, who is the editor-in-chief of Responsible Statecraft and was an editor also at the American Conservative. And then we have Peter, who is writing a book on Moynihan and runs the Gotham Center for New York History. So, let's begin.
Thank you, Clint. Let me begin with an apology. I've prepared something that is too long to deliver, so I'm going to be editing as I go. The simple answer to the question is yes, the American Revolution was liberal. But this begs another question: what is meant by the term liberal? By liberal, I mean a new understanding of the living together of men and women in the world that developed with the emergence of a society based on the universal freedom of labor. This society developed on the westernmost end of the Eurasian landmass, basically Europe west of the Elbe River, during the late Middle Ages and the early modern era. Classical Marxists referred to this society based on universal free labor as bourgeois society. And they viewed this new way of understanding the living together of men and women in the world, that is liberalism, as, quote, the practical idealism of daily life in bourgeois society. When Marx wrote this line in the 1840s, bourgeois society and its most advanced thinking, that is liberalism, was in crisis amid the industrialization and proletarianization of society and the fracturing of the left that emerged in the later 18th and early 19th century age of revolution into two opposed camps, that of classical liberalism and classical socialism. The classical liberalism of the 19th century represented the ossification of radical bourgeois thought. It was no longer liberalism as revolutionary critique, but as ideology. Why did the revolutionary liberalism the revolutionary practical idealism of the 17th and 18th centuries emerge in Western Europe and its Atlantic offshoots. It was not because of long-standing Greco-Roman or Judeo-Christian traditions. Rather, it was because of a world historical jailbreak. That is to say, a number of factors combined together. A number of factors combined together without any intention to create an unprecedented zone of free labor from the Mediterranean to the North Sea, from the Elbe River to the Atlantic Ocean. For the first time, there emerged a significant world region in which unfree labor no longer existed by the year 1500. There are many factors that I could use to explain this outcome. We could talk about the crisis of feudalism and the collapse of serfdom in the later Middle Ages. We could talk about the urbanization and commercialization of the High Middle Ages and the Renaissance. We could talk about the Age of Exploration and the discovery of a direct maritime passage to Asia and of the Americas. All of these came together to have the cumulative effect of bringing into being a society based on the universal freedom of labor. In this society of free labor, there was set in train a dialectic of labor and consciousness, perhaps best explained by Hegel, first in the phenomenology of spirit, and later in the philosophy of right. People, it's hard for us to recall now, but if we go back to the 15th and 16th centuries, there began to emerge in this society of free labor just people in their quotidian everyday life playing a much greater role in the course of their own existence, having to decide how they spent their laboring activity, their life activity, how to plant crops, how to invest. Did they want to work harder and smarter to have more of a surplus to trade with others? And in this zone of free labor in Western Europe that emerged an incredible amount of free exchange and intercourse in which people freely interacted, congregated, associated, assembled with others. And in this world of increasing free socialization, there was a greater prompting of consciousness, of self-consciousness, as people came to understand their own power, their own capability to determine their own existence, both individually and collectively with others. And so this freedom of labor created a deepening of consciousness, a greater self-consciousness and self-awareness. Socialization led to the deepening of consciousness. That is to say, the expansion of a free society led to an expansion of subjectivity. This world of civil or bourgeois society, if you forgive my poor German pronunciation, this world of bürgerliche Gesellschaft, emerged in the free relations of quotidian daily life. It came into existence in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, long before it received formal recognition in the law and by the state. From Petrarch to Pico della Mirandola in the 14th and 15th centuries, to Descartes and Locke in the 17th century, to Adam Smith and Rousseau in the 18th century, we witness the emerging intellectual self-consciousness of this civil society and the development of the revolutionary practical idealism of daily life, of liberalism. At the core of this new understanding of men and women living together in the world was not an atomistic individualism in which there is, as Margaret Thatcher said, no such thing as society, but rather that the most fundamental thing is society as such, that society is the fundamental basis of human existence, the ontological grounds of our existence, that the best form of society, the most, if you forgive me, social society, is one based on free labor in which the individual is subjectively independent but objectively interdependent, that is, dependent on others in the free relations of daily life. And furthermore, that such a society needs no justification outside of itself, not in the gods, not in bloodlines, not in ancient traditions. Such a society can be justified on its own basis, on the prosperity and freedom that it delivers to its members individually and collectively. By the mid-18th century, the civil society, the bourgeois society of the Western world, was discontented with the old regime, and that existed everywhere, from the Austrian Netherlands to Italian city-states to France to Britain and across the Atlantic in the European empires of the Americas. This new civil society of the free relations of daily life came up against the encumbrances, the entanglements, the obstacles, the blockages that the world historical old regime presented. And by the old regime, I do not simply mean the ancien regime of Bourbon France. I mean all of the existing regimes in the Western world, whether it was the parliamentary oligarchy of Great Britain and its empire, the ossified commercial and financial oligarchy that dominated the Dutch Republic, the aristocratic landed elite that dominated Poland, or the absolute monarchies that dotted the European landscapes, from Habsburg Austria to Hohenzollern Prussia to Bourbon France and Spain. There was incredible discontent with the old world, the old regime everywhere in these emergent free relations of daily life. People felt that the political order was a burden on their own free social existence. This discontent went the farthest in colonial British North America amid the Anglo-American imperial crisis of the 1760s and 1770s. Why? Why did this discontent with the old regime and the old world go farthest there? Because there, beyond the slave plantations, among the free settler populations of the 13 colonies from Georgia in the south to New Hampshire in the north, civil society had advanced the farthest, as Adam Smith explained in The Wealth of Nations, published 250 years ago in March of 1776. And it was there in colonial British North America by 1776 that, having been denied the historic rights of Englishmen, the colonial resistance movement transformed into a revolutionary movement on the basis solely of this new understanding of civil society. What I'm saying is the colonial American resistance movement initially was small c conservative. It simply wanted its traditional, historical, customary rights of Englishmen. But having been denied those rights, they took the great leap into the unknown, which was to embrace the fact that the only justification necessary for what they were doing was a free society itself, what they called natural rights or the rights of mankind. Before the Second Continental Congress explained the reasons that, quote, impelled them to the separation from the British Empire, they announced the transformation of the revolution of society into the revolution for society, making what remains to this day the most important statement ever uttered by revolutionary liberalism. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In other words, the Declaration of Independence was not merely declaring the independence of the United States from the British Empire, but it was declaring the independence of civil society, of the free relations of daily life amongst regular, humble men and women from the world as it was, the world of hereditary status, of caste, of arbitrary power and domination, of a world in which some are born to rule and most are born to be ruled. 50 years after declaring independence, there was a celebration of the 50th anniversary of July 4th in Washington, D.C. on July 4th, 1826. And the committee responsible for that celebration at the 50th anniversary invited Thomas Jefferson to come to D.C. from Monticello in Virginia and to participate in the 50th anniversary celebrations. He couldn't. He received the invitation in late June 1826 as he lay dying. He essentially was in his deathbed for weeks. And he penned his last great statement in response to this invitation. He wrote, and I hope you will permit me ending on a long quote, The kind invitation I received from you on the part of the citizens of the city of Washington to be present with them at their celebration of the 50th anniversary of American independence as one of the surviving signers of an instrument pregnant with our own and the fate of the world is most flattering to myself and heightened by the honorable accompaniment proposed for the comfort of such a journey. It adds sensibly to the sufferings of sickness to be deprived by it of a personal participation in the rejoicings of that day. But acquiescence is a duty under circumstances not placed amongst those we are permitted to control. I should indeed, with peculiar delight, have met and exchanged their congratulations personally with the small band, the remnant of that host of worthies who joined with us on that day in the bold and doubtful election we were to make for our country between submission or the sword, and to have enjoyed with them the consolatory fact that our fellow citizens, after half a century of experience and prosperity, continue to approve the choice we made. May it be to the world what I believe it will be, to some parts sooner, to others later, but finally to all, the signal of an arousing men to burst the chains under which monkish ignorance and superstition have persuaded them to bind themselves, and to assume the blessings and security of self-government. The form which we have substituted restores the free right to the unbounded exercise of reason and freedom of opinion. All eyes are opened or opening to the rights of man. The general spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view the palpable truth that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. I'll conclude where I began. The American Revolution was indeed liberal. Indeed, you could not have a more liberal statement than what I just read to you. Thank you, and apologies for going over time.
Okay. All right, so my opening remarks are going to be adapted from an essay that I wrote about my conflicted relationship with American liberalism. Here it goes. I wouldn't be caught dead wearing American flag theme apparel, let alone flying the flag in public. I go out of my way to make sarcastic, biting jokes about America's hypocrisy on national holidays, and I scoff at my parents, loyalists to the Democratic Party, when they repeat the well-known bit about how, despite its many flaws, this is still a great nation. Yes, I'm a millennial, in case that was not blatantly obvious to you already. Like many of my peers, I'm prone to a deadly combination of pessimistic cynicism and utopian idealism. Mind you, my brand of millennial idealism is a special one. Just like a snowflake, I am unlike all the others. Being a moderate liberal or conservative was cringe, but so was being a woke SJW or a far-right anti-woke reactionary, for that matter. Instead, my sympathies lie with the emerging post-liberal movement. To be specific, the brand of communitarian post-liberalism championed by the likes of John Milbank, William T. Kavanaugh, and the followers of Dorothy Day, as opposed to its Christian nationalist or its integralist forms popularized by Patrick Deneen and Adrian Vermeule, respectively. Of course, it's very easy to play the game of picking apart liberal democracy for its flaws while living in the comfort of a liberal democratic country. Among the many freedoms enjoyed by citizens in a democracy, writes the journalist Shadi Hamid in his latest book, The Case for American Power, one of the least appreciated is the freedom to panic and assume that the worst is yet to come. This is a right and luxury that is generally lacking under dictatorship. Hamid highlights that those of us living in liberal democracies have grown accustomed to expressing either doubt or a kind of ironic detachment about our own success. To say that you love democracy or that you love America, he concedes, is to be decidedly uncool. He continues by writing, "I feel uncool just writing this." Yet he affirms that in his book that his book is not about the crisis of American democracy because he doesn't believe that there is a crisis. The only crisis is our inability to see what's right in front of our very eyes. When I read Hamid's book recently, I felt that it was a personal attack of sorts. Narratives of decline continue to appeal to denizens of liberal democracies like me because, according to him, it is more thrilling to think that the world might be ending than the likelier possibility, that it will be bad, but it won't be that bad. In the absence of war, invent one, in other words. Declinists like myself often have a set of retorts ready to go when people use this to shut down our damning critique of American liberalism. Yet, I have to admit that I find it harder to fall back on my lofty ideas and simply scoff at Shadi Hamid as yet another out-of-touch, naive cringe lib. The more I grapple with the cloying questions figures like Hamid raise, I find that I can't help but admit that despite its numerous errors, or rather its numerous horrors, liberal democracy is a net positive. It's better to have rights within a really cringe form of government than to live under an authoritarian regime. Liberalism is at best a necessary evil while we're stuck in the city of man. It would be foolish to toss out St. Augustine's wisdom and delude ourselves into thinking that there is a perfect form of government. Should a form of government one day arise that embodies the idealism of Dorothy Day's type of anarcho-syndicalism or Chestertonian agrarian distributism, I'll be the first to move there. But until that happens, I'll take the libland over anywhere else that exists right now. That being said, I will remain determined to call out its imperfections and mock it ceaselessly, and will continue to be extremely skeptical about anyone who speaks about liberalism in an overly optimistic light, even if only to indulge my contrarian millennial snowflake complex. To my credit, there is something deeply deceptive about liberalism, a danger which I believe to be more feature than bug. My problem is that it tends to mask its imperfections, and its whole project writ large. Other forms of government are more blatant about their agenda, and thus its evils are more apparent. In particular, it's liberalism's claim to neutrality that disturbs me most. Liberalism is anything but neutral. Yes, we are allotted certain freedoms. We are not free in the way that liberalism tells us that we are. For example, we have much more freedom of speech than any other form of government allows, but there is no such thing as absolute freedom of speech. Liberal democracies claim to be neutral when it comes to religion. We are free to practice the religion of our choice. Yet, in reality, liberalism not only restricts our freedom to practice religion, but propagates a religion of its own, covertly propagating its beliefs under the guise of neutrality. When we embrace liberalism wholeheartedly, when we are overly optimistic toward it and are naive about its pitfalls, we risk drinking the Kool-Aid, allowing liberalism's lies to sink into our souls and poison us. While I believe that these errors are more feature than bug, I'm not going to argue that we should give up on liberalism wholesale. The bug can certainly be mitigated, most immediately by constantly shitting on it in our public discourse and being open to engaging with post-liberal ideas, again, without becoming escapists or complete utopians. But aside from my theoretical and ideological concerns about liberalism, I also find it concerning on a personal, which is to say a psychological and even a spiritual level. Perhaps the best depiction of everything that's wrong with American liberalism is the proliferation of what they call stroads. Neither a street nor a road nor a highway, a stroad is a worst of all worlds combo that features multiple lanes lined with chain stores and restaurants, parking lots, and devoid of sidewalks. I don't know has anyone seen the stroad meme? I think it's something like, why don't kids go outside today? And then they show a stroad, and then they say this is the outside that they built. Well, you see a lot of them in Jersey. It's a thing. But this is why I hate stroads. Stroads are emblematic of everything that is wrong with this country. It's a land that cultivates disenchantment, deracination, the uprooting from tradition, from heritage, from culture, atomization, loneliness, and that promises ever greater freedom. I can shop from any store as I'm driving along the stroad. It's an ever greater freedom that weakens our agency, and thus our capacity to live fulfilled lives. Also, lots of people die on stroads because there are no sidewalks, so they're just bad. Indeed, Shadi Hamid touches on this epidemic of meaninglessness that ravages the nation, conceding that in liberal democracies, it's extremely difficult to come together around ultimate questions of what makes a good society and a good life. I fear that not only does this lack of a clear notion of the good set us up for a culture of despair, it also opens the door to abuses of power by people claiming to be champions of, quote, the good. Could it be that the rootlessness, despair, the bureaucratic bloat, and technocratic overreach are the inevitable result of liberal democracy? Perhaps not, but my experience of spiritual and psychological suffocation that I had growing up, of being told to brush aside questions about ultimate truth and meaning, and instead to, quote, just be myself, to try to be a good person, and to make the world a better place, inclines me to feel this way. Eventually, after going through a bout with depression, suffering a mental breakdown, I found people who took my search for meaning seriously and helped me to find answers to my existential questions. Hamid would insist that this is what's great about American liberalism. It doesn't force truth claims on you. It frees you to find your own truth. My fear is that this claim of the freedom to find my own truth is ultimately to say that there is no actual truth. There is no objective meaning. It was only by swimming upstream of this kind of nihilistic, disenchanted culture engendered by liberalism that I was able to find any purpose, any sense that life is actually worth living. Thus, I'm stuck in a position of disliking, yet reluctantly accepting liberalism as a lesser of all evils. While I can't offer any definitive assessment of 250 years of American liberal democracy, I can say that for now, perhaps we'd do well to return to some of the key insights of de Tocqueville, namely about the importance of maintaining civic and religious institutions that encourage everyday people to engage their agency and to live meaningful, dynamic lives. Indeed, liberalism cannot offer us an adequate cosmological framework and thus cannot be allowed to serve as a replacement for things like religion or civic institutions. And its tendency to propagate forms of power that are extremely centralized and totalizing, protected by the illusory claim of neutrality and egalitarianism, must be restrained by a strong civic society, by communities, by families, which act as a bulwark against ideological manipulation and corruptions of power. At the end of the day, I acknowledge that I might just be a privileged snowflake in search of an axe to grind. Might be the case. One of those kinds of people who has no real problems, so I had to invent some. Could be true, but that doesn't mean my assessment is totally wrong. And in the least, liberalism allows me opportunities like this to grind my axe in public. Thank you.
Okay, I'm on. So I'm going to take a bit of a different tack. I'm a journalist, and I actually specialize in foreign policy. So I'm going to take the question of whether or not the revolution was liberal, and I would say yes. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how it went off the rails and how liberal foreign policy went more progressive and radical to the foreign policy that we see today and how that all happened. So I'll talk a little bit about the revolution itself. It was the expression of the American mind at the moment of the Declaration. Thomas Jefferson, as did many thinkers at the time, John Adams, George Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Paine, Franklin, James Wilson, Dickinson, they all drew inspiration from the classical thinkers, Aristotle, Locke, Cicero, Plato. So the country was born in a classical liberalism, which pursued the principles of individual liberty, private property, limited government intervention, and free markets. The philosophy argues that governments exist solely to protect natural rights, such as man was born free and equal with the right to life, liberty, and property, rather to manage the economy or society. That people are the only legitimate source of power, and the government's powers are derived solely from the consent of the governed. One of my favorite professors, Bradley Birzer, conservative, calls himself a Christian humanist, said that the Declaration served as a beacon of light to a world full of oppression, which is kind of what Stephen was talking about earlier, that it was a clarion call for human dignity, and it demanded that Americans rise to their better selves. The language it deployed was written to be read for all, read out from pulpits and pubs into all public forums. The language was to be the language of the people themselves. As Stephen had pointed out, we hold these truths to be self-evident, was the most important statement in history, in the history of the world about human dignity. And no matter the sins of Thomas Jefferson or the founders, they got this is my professor, Brad Berzer, they got something so right. All of American history has been playing out in that one sentence. Cicero, which he was the single most influential Roman for the founders, his conception of natural rights traces back to him. The best society cultivates us as free individuals, not for our benefit, but for the benefit of the community. The people that is ruled by a king lacks a great deal and more than anything lacks liberty. The king easily becomes a tyrant. So classical liberals identified the republic as incorporating the three branches of government that would keep the other in check. This goes back to the teachings of Cicero on the republic. So basically, what I'm kind of getting at here is that the liberalism espoused by the founders was heavily steeped in the idea of, as you know, the government, of the people, the consent of the people. But this wasn't a purely American tradition or approach. Obviously, as I mentioned, the classical philosophers, but then the Enlightenment, the Magna Carta in 1215, which led obviously to the Glorious Revolution that established the common law. All of these things led to our American independence, the Declaration. I would like to focus a little bit more on how all of this translated into foreign policy and to make the argument that it is an American tradition and that is anti-imperial and non-interventionist tradition. I'm quoting now from a farmer, quote unquote, who wrote anonymous pen letters in 1788 for a Baltimore newspaper, who talked about or warned about standing armies, and at that time was calling for the Bill of Rights and declared, paraphrasing Jonathan Swift, that, quote, laws are cobwebs, catching only the flies and letting the wasps escape. Seesawing between fears of an aristocratic legislature and a tyrannical executive, this farmer argued that we'd be best off with the highly decentralized democracy found in certain Swiss cantons. Quote, if I am told that the people are incapable of governing themselves like the Swiss, he wrote, I shall answer that it has never been tried in America except among the native Indians who are free and happy and who prove that self-government is the growth of our soil. Nor did he accept, this farmer, that a national government would be better to protect us from foreign subversion or invasion. The only foreign, he said, or at least evil foreign influence must be obtained through corruption, he argued, and that, quote, facility of corruption is increased in proportion as power tends to a concentration in the hands of a few. After offering reasons to doubt a confederation that would be more attractive to invaders, his essay warned of the opposite danger, that America itself would become an empire. Quote, it was the extensive territory of the Roman Republic that produced a Sylla, a Marius, a Caligula, a Nero. He wrote, decentralism magnified not just the power of a voice, but also the power of the exit. In small independent states contiguous to each other, the people run away and leave despotism to wreak its vengeance on itself. I see a lot of this in the writings of George Washington, who, as you know, in his farewell address, gave advice towards foreign affairs that I and the American Conservative, for which I was the editor, and the Responsible Statecraft tried to live by these tenets, and we see it playing out today in everything, talking about the permanent inveterate antipathies against particular nations and passionate attachment for others, the entangling alliances that would actually come back to impinge upon our liberties at home. He talked about To be free of the frequent controversies that plague Europe, Americans should steer clear of these permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. He mentions his neutrality proclamation of 1793 that he issued when France declared war on England. It had a right to take and was bound in duty and interest to take a neutral position. John Quincy Adams in 1821, for which the Quincy Institute was named for, talked about wherever the standard of freedom and independence has been or shall be unfurled, there will be her heart, her benedictions and her prayers be, but she goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own. She will recommend the general cause by the countenance of her voice and a sympathy of her example. I won't go further, but it's a beautiful extrapolation of his speech in 1821. But he basically talked about how she would become the dictatress of the world and no longer the ruler of her own spirit if she did indeed go in search of monsters to destroy and try to impose the will and the values of American liberty on other nations. So to me, personally, that is where everything starts. That is the sort of primordial ooze of our foreign policy. Now, where did it go off the rails? Well, scholars, I'm not a scholar, so I'm just following what my sense of this is that there was a second awakening. There was a Protestant evangelicalism in the 19th century that, was sort of the beginnings of progressivism. How did that affect foreign policy? Well, you have, folks like John Stuart Mill, who one of the founders of progressivism and liberalism, but when it came to foreign policy, he saw that, he had a more of a paternalistic outlook and basically famously justified British imperialism as a, quote, civilizing mission. He argued that societies he deemed barbarous or backward were incapable of self-government, and that imperial rule was a paternalistic temporary necessity to prepare them for liberal democratic autonomy. In his foundational essay on liberty in 1859, Mill posited that the harm principle, which states that power can only be rightfully exercised over someone against their will to prevent harm to others, only applies to people in civilized communities. For societies he deemed childlike and uncivilized, he argued that paternalistic intervention was justified for their own good to accelerate their moral and material progress. In December of 1904, I'm zipping ahead here, but the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine stated that the United States would intervene in Latin America as a last resort to ensure that other nations in the Western Hemisphere fulfilled their obligations to international creditors, did not violate the rights of the United States, and basically for their own good. So the original Monroe Doctrine was to keep foreign empires from encroaching in the Western Hemisphere and to recolonize some places in our neighborhood. This was actually saying that we could use force to ensure that, but as you know, it was used and justified for the intervention in Cuba, Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic. Then we get to the progressives in World War I that were more Wilsonian, and obviously with the justification there in part was that to impose liberal democracy on the rest of the world. I know I'm probably running out of time, but then you can see this, replicated in the Cold War, the fight against the communism, the domino theory, all the way up through, 9/11. And the justification of the global war on terror in order to liberate, oppress, and we know this wasn't the real justification, but used by George W. Bush and Democratic hawks like Hillary Clinton, that we had to sort of spread democracy, and whether that be at the butt of a gun. And this, and this is also replicated in our justification for NATO, for collective security in the transatlantic relationship. So all to say is that I believe personally, and I am a big believer, and you and I had talked about this, before, that in the America First movement has been, smeared as a caricature of racism and ethno-nationalism. But I do believe that it is actually a throwback to the liberal project of non-interventionism and anti-imperialism steeped in the founding and the liberal founding that had gone off the rails due to liberal, radical evangelicalism and progressivism in the 19th century, and has continued today and is justified on both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, and we could talk about that, Republicans, and that the founding and the revolution was, in fact, liberal in every best sense of the word.
This on? Okay. Give me a second, sorry guys. Okay, my presentation, and I'm also a historian, so mine's going to pick up a bit, I think, where James left off, but maybe touch on some of the themes raised, hopefully. The term liberalism first emerged in 1811 to describe the politics of those around such thinkers as Benjamin Constant and Madame de Staël in France, who offered a sympathetic criticism of the French Revolution. This marked the end of the development of a notion of liberal politics as a distinctly modern preoccupation. I would like to suggest today that this notion of a specifically modern politics concerned above all with freedom in the most capacious sense of the term, and organized according to nothing other than the rules of reason which society discovers for itself, was only possible because of the American Revolution and the reflections it inspired across the world in the inheritors of the Enlightenment. Radical bourgeois thinkers in Europe looked to America as revealing and developing a new form of freedom. This they called liberal. In his 1784 observations on the importance of the American Revolution, the radical Whig Richard Price remarked, "The faculties of man have hitherto, in all countries, been more or less cramped by the interference of civil authority in matters of speculation, by tyrannical laws against heresy and schism, and by slavish hierarchies and religious establishments. It is above all things desirable that no such fetters on reason should be admitted into America. I observe with inexpressible satisfaction that at present they have no existence there. In this respect, the governments of the United States are liberal to a degree that is unparalleled. They have the distinguished honor of being the first states under heaven in which forms of government have been established favorable to universal liberty. They have been thus distinguished in their infancy. What then will they be in a more advanced state, when time and experience and the concurring assistance of the wise and virtuous in every part of the earth shall have introduced into the new governments corrections and amendments which will render them still more friendly to liberty, and more the means of promoting human happiness and dignity? May we not see there the dawning of brighter days on earth, and a new creation rising?" The American Revolution was liberal because it was modern. It did not have to concede to and compromise with tradition in its social or political organization, and it had no need to lie to itself about its own content. In America, the creative act which constitutes popular sovereignty, an awesome and dangerous power, was not the matter of chance, nor the evolution of cultural norms and inherited institutions, but rather the subject of a conscious act. The Americans, unlike any people ever to take the power to destroy a constitution and forge a new one, did so with purpose and in view of universal reason and freedom. David Ramsey, a South Carolina physician and historian writing the first history of the American Revolution, which he presented to a European audience in 1789 as the French Revolution was breaking out, wrote of the Constitution, "In this short view of the formation and establishment of the American constitutions, we behold our species in a new situation. In no age before and in no other country did man ever possess an election of the kind of government under which he would choose to live. The constituent parts of the ancient free governments were thrown together by accident. The freedom of modern European governments was, for the most part, obtained by the concessions or liberality of monarchs or military leaders. In America alone, reason and liberty concurred in the formation of constitutions. It is true, from the infancy of political knowledge in the United States, there were many defects in their forms of government, but in one thing they were all perfect. They left the people in the power of altering and amending them whenever they pleased. In this happy peculiarity, they placed the science of politics on a footing with the other sciences by opening it to improvements from experience and the discoveries of future ages." And I feel like we see here already what Alexis de Tocqueville will later remark on in Democracy in America, which is that the perfect quality of America makes them lovers, natural lovers of the perfectibility of man, and that it's the adaptability and transformation also of the U.S. political institution that redoubles a sort of consciousness of freedom. And also that you need a new political science for a new world. That's another, I think, very famous remark Alexis de Tocqueville made. They were already aware of this, right, in 1789, that this is what was important about the American Revolution. For freedom to realize itself, it had to leave the European cradle. It had to leave Europe behind. Europe came to judge its own revolutions by the metric of American liberalism. In her remarks on the French Revolution, Madame de Staël wrote, "The American Declaration of Rights, being intended for a people where there were no pre-existing privileges to impede the pure operation of reason, a number of universal principles regarding political liberty and equality were placed at the beginning of this declaration, altogether in conformity with the state of knowledge already diffused among them, e.g. in society. In England, the Bill of Rights did not proceed on general ideas, it confirmed existing laws and institutions." She's kind of confounding here the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, but she's considering them both in relationship to the English Bill of Rights from which they descended, and remarking on how, in fact, they exceed the English Bill of Rights for this reason. And then when she compares it to the Declaration of the Rights of Man in the French Revolution, she remarks that the advantage of the American Bill of Rights is that it doesn't contain anything extra. It only contains what is absolutely necessary and according to reason. And that's what makes it so liberal. And speaking further of America, she remarks, "What is there more honorable for mankind than this new world, which has established itself without the prejudices of the old? This new world where religion in all its fervor, without needing the support of the state to maintain it, where the law commands by the respect which it inspires, without being enforced by any military power. It is possible, alas, that Europe may be destined, like Asia, to exhibit one day the spectacle of a stationary civilization." Are we there today? "Which, not having been able to advance, has become degraded." So for liberals in Europe, America was, as Hegel later wrote, the land of the future. Europe slumbered in the dream of the past. The task of liberal thinkers was to clarify the meaning and tasks of modern freedom through study and reflection on the American Revolution. Benjamin Constant did so in his Liberty of the Ancients as compared to that of the moderns, remarking that the confusion of ancient and modern liberty had been the cause of many an evil in France's happy revolution. He then asked the gentleman listening to his speech to think about what it is that an Englishman, a Frenchman, and a citizen of the United States of America understand today by the word liberty, and how it might differ from the ancients. He writes that for them, it is the right to be subjected only to the laws and to be neither arrested, detained, put to death, or maltreated in any way by the arbitrary will of one or more individuals. It is the right of everyone to express their opinion, choose a profession and practice it, to dispose of property, and even to abuse it, I like that one, to come and go without permission and without having to account for their motives or undertakings. It is everyone's right to associate with other individuals, either to discuss their interests or to profess the religion which they and their associates prefer, or even simply to occupy their days or hours in a way which is most compatible with their inclinations and whims. Finally, it is everyone's right to exercise some influence on the administration of the government, either by electing all or particular officials, or through representations, petitions, demands, to which the authorities are more or less compelled to pay heed. He goes on to counterpose ancient liberties. So I think this is quite important because even though, of course, Constant knew the ancients, he was a man educated in the ancients, as was everyone, for him, modern liberty is a new form of life, right? It doesn't come from inherited institutions, and it requires new thought, right? The old thought is not adequate, or at least it has to be transformed. For Constant, modern liberty also carried with it a new danger. This was the danger of the self-domination of the people in and through their popular sovereignty, and it required a critical clarification of Rousseau's concept of the general will. In his Principles of Politics, Constant remarked that Rousseau's concept of the general will had been largely misunderstood by his followers in France. Rousseau had understood the horror of the immense social power that was created, and he could find no other protection against the danger inseparable from this sovereignty than an expedient which made its exercise impossible. He declared that sovereignty could not be alienated, delegated, or represented. This was equivalent to declaring, in other words, that it could not be exercised. It meant in practice destroying the principles which had just been proclaimed. That's Constant remarking on Rousseau. So the sovereign, or as Constant sometimes calls it, the social body, and I think this is important, right? The sovereign is not the state, it's the social body, can harm neither the totality of its members nor any of them in particular, in Rousseau's understanding. Since everyone gives himself entirely, all share the same condition, right? They're in perfect equality. And nobody is interested in making that condition onerous to others, because every individual gives himself to all, equally submits to the sovereign that they're creating. He does not give himself to anyone in particular. Everybody acquires over his associates the same rights as he surrenders in their favor. Thus, he gains the equivalent of all that he loses, together with the greater strength to preserve what he has. However, and this is the problem Constant wants to specify, as soon as it is necessary to proceed to the practical organization of authority, the sovereignty must in fact be delegated, or it will be unable to act upon itself. Okay, so this creates a problem for sovereignty. We've erected this absolute power, and now in order for it to act, actually, it must be delegated. It must become a means, and that means could dominate, right? The people who first came together to create it. This leads Constant to argue that sovereignty must be limited, but limited how and by what? By nothing other than the ends of sovereignty itself. Constant writes, the assent of people cannot legitimate what it is illegitimate, because the people cannot delegate to anyone authority which they do not themselves possess. And what is illegitimate? That which abrogates the freedom for which the people originally entered into the social body and constituted the monstrous power of sovereignty. So the recognition of the limits of sovereignty was only the clarification of the end goal of sovereignty, which is freedom. So according to Constant, this clarification of social freedom was not theoretical, but real, and it was demonstrated by America. He writes, an example more imposing still than the theories even the most estimable writers has, it is true, come to the rescue of my principles, precisely while I was laboring to expound them. It is the conduct of the American government, such as it was pronounced by the President of the United States on his installation, and such as it has been for the last 10 years. And then he quotes at length Jefferson. I won't read the whole thing, but just a little bit of it so you get a sense. Although the will of the majority, said Mr. Jefferson on March 4th, 1801, must prevail in all cases, that will, to be legitimate, must be reasonable. The minority possesses equal rights, which equal law must protect. To violate these rights would be an oppression. It is sometimes said that man must not be entrusted with his own self-government. But then how could one entrust him to the government of others? Entrust to him the government of others, Or have angels perhaps been found in the form of kings to govern us? To prevent men from doing each other mutual harm and to leave them otherwise full freedom to manage themselves in the efforts of their work and in their progress towards improvement. That is the sole purpose of good government. Equal and right justice for all men, whatever their condition or their belief, religious or political, peace, trade, straightforwardness with other nations, without insidious alliances with any, the maintenance of the governments of the individual states and all their rights as the most convenient administration for our domestic interests and the most certain bulwark against anti-republican tendencies, the conservation of the federal government and its full constitutional vigor as the guarantee of our peace within and our security without, scrupulous attention to the right of election by the people, a sweet and sure correction of abuses which otherwise the sword of revolutions destroy, when no peaceful remedy has been prepared, an unreserved acceptance of the decisions of the majority, a well-disciplined militia, our best safeguard in time of peace and during the first moments of a war until regular troops can come back. Economy, trial by jury, it goes on, freedom of the press, right? So he just goes through the Bill of Rights. This is the point of government. So I realized when I was writing this that there was one other thing Constant says that actually I think is quite appropriate for us to consider, which is why is it that what form does this problem of popular sovereignty take? It poses the question of whether it's possible to organize what Constant calls the social interest, right? Can you organize society as such without empowering it to dominate itself through the state? Right, without giving up the ends, which is the freedom of all, right, and making the state an end in itself, which is going to, in fact, dominate everyone, right, and destroy all freedom. And for Constant, it appears that the only way to do this is, in fact, through the protection of the individual interest. So for Constant, you wouldn't actually oppose the social to the individual interest, but the individual interest would be a way, right, through its opposite, through its negation of clarifying what the social interest actually is, right? Because the purpose of society, why did we constitute this social body and this social power, right? It was to safeguard the freedom of these individuals. This is actually, and this is where I'm going to end, but I would say this, socialism picks up exactly from liberalism on this question, right? The question of how it is that one can represent the social interest, right? How can the social interest be organized in society? And in fact, it's the American Revolution which makes it possible for the practice of political science, right? Remember the David Ramsey, but this is what Benjamin Constant is talking about. You can actually the American Constitution and its radicalization under Jefferson has allowed popular sovereignty for the first time, right, to try and pursue actively in social life, right, through political means, its own ends of freedom. And I would say that this is actually the basis upon which the questions that became known as socialism could even be asked. Robert Owen called his own system liberal. And like other utopian socialists, looked to America to realize his project. The 19th century in America saw utopian socialist projects around the country. And actually, this is something Benjamin Constant shares with the socialists because he's a big supporter of a Bonapartist project of Bonapartist refugees who went to Texas, right? So he was in and around through the magazine Minerva. He would have been around some of these projects. Liberalism becomes, in the 19th century, right, as a result of the crisis of political forms in the face of new social problems, right? It becomes both a consciousness of the failure of socialism to realize modern freedom, landing instead of in the future, in the past, but it also has to reckon with itself, right? The coming of liberal governments in the 1830s looks like not the realization of liberal principles of freedom, but instead like a regression to despotic forms of the state. And Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America remarks upon this in the final book, where he talks about what leads to centralization of government power. And he says, well, it's a social problem, right? When you have democracy and equality without freedom, right? When you have this sort of social crisis where people don't know they're free and the meaning of their freedom is unclear, that's when you get the centralization of the state and you slip back into despotic government. So this is why America, in a way, becomes the measure not only of liberalism, but of socialism. America is the objective form of modern freedom by which any politics must be measured, and by which not just liberalism, but socialism, if it is to have a future on this earth, must be judged worthy. Thanks.
Is that better? Yeah, there we go. Morning. My name is Peter Christian Aigner. I think I'm here because I run the Gotham Center for New York City History, and we created a freedom trail for New York City, and that later is now an app, and we did this big exhibition at the Museum of the City of New York. I did my PhD at the Kennedy Graduate School. I actually started out as an intellectual historian, so this is a kind of interesting conversation for me to be having. It's kind of I very much moved away from all that, but it's a throwback. I was almost going to do my PhD in this period of history. I'm a 20th century historian. I have a biography of Moynihan coming out in a few months. And I didn't know until a couple of days ago whether I'd be participating in this, so I don't have prepared remarks, and so maybe that's better. I'll just kind of briefly play off of what folks have been saying here today. Part of the reason why I moved away from intellectual history is just a growing dissatisfaction. I still retain the fascination with these great thinkers, and I do think that the power of it. I'm enough of a sort of non-vulgar Marxist to know that ideas have power in history and such. But just the general dissatisfaction with the inability of a focus on the stated ideals of this period to explain the development of American history or world history. My work on New York City's experience in the American Revolution, which we argue, and I won't go into this, but it was really the city at the heart of the American Revolution, is that the revolution does not really quite come about because of whatever Adams and these folks were talking about. I do think that the liberal context, to answer this question about whether or not the revolution was liberal, yes, I do. I think that's an obvious answer. The academics tore themselves apart for 20-some years about this question. The debate over the Louis Hart's thesis of whether or not America was born liberal. But for the person on the ground, they're much more basic questions, especially in a place like New York or any of the other cities that we focus on when we talk about the American Revolution, where folks are born into this liberal order that they take for granted, much as we take for granted the order that we live in, and all of these sort of philosophical underpinnings that are developed, I think, rather sort of ad hoc or post hoc to explain why they came into being. For those folks, they were really basic questions of bread and butter of, how am I going to feed my family and who's sticking the gun in my face? And I do believe, along with all of those great historians who came out of the 1960s who talked about not just the severe limits of this revolution, right, after which the state of freedom or democracy as we would understand it is not really significantly all that much greater than it was before the revolution. That those ideas nonetheless did create a sort of intellectual event, right, that contributed to this thing we know as the age of democratic revolution, and more importantly, over the longue durée, right, informed these struggles for genuine democracy that appeared later. So I do not want to sort of discount the importance of the American Revolution as a world historical event. But there are severe limits to that, and I think to address the second part of the question today about its legacy, You know, yes, so there was much talk about the freedom that this liberal order produced, right? And just to define our terms some more, you know, this is a capitalist order. Why was America born liberal, as Hart said? You know, stretching back to, you know, the Hart's debate, this seems like a very sort of academically informed audience, but for sake of many folks that are watching on YouTube later, you know, part of that is this preface of the Fukuyama debate at the end of the Cold War, and what we now know is the conversation around capitalist realism and the impossibility to think beyond liberalism or capitalism, which those two terms were interchangeable for the longest time. You know, America is born liberal because it's born as a product of the British Empire. And they are very much happy to remain part of that British Empire until the British, like every empire, right, enter one of these periods in which they need to economize. So the whole reason the American Revolution comes about is because the British create their first global empire, and they create a staggering amount of debt to do that, right? So we all remember the slogan from the Sons of Liberty, no taxation without representation, which is an absurdity because the English have no more representation than the colonists do. Again, it's this sort of high-minded principle that really distorts the way we should sort of understand this history, however important as it is for later political developments. So yes, so we're born into this world of freedom, but what does that freedom mean? I mean, the vast majority of folks who come to this country, the famous line from Samuel Johnson is that it's a country of criminals, right? Because the English are the first to, with all respect to Sven Beckert and this literature that's come out about the global origins of capitalism, you know, you might have had capitalism in, you know, 1100s in Yemen, in some parts or different parts around the world, but you don't really get capitalism as we understand it, high growth capitalism, until the English come about, right? And that's a much more material factor. That's about the development of fossil powered industrialism, right? High growth. English over the process of 500-600 years basically privatize all their land. There's a struggle between the feudal, sort of conservative tradition that resists capitalism and these liberal merchants who go on to be sort of the great imperialists of the global high age of imperialism. And they free the serfs, but that creates a credible amount of dependence. So why is America a race of criminals and paupers? Because those folks are thrown off those feudal lands. They're often, it creates incredible pauperism, the term that's coined around this period. The state then, grows tenfold the number of, it's something like 550 crimes for capital punishment, and then within a century or so, there's 500, and the vast majority of those are about property crimes because the poverty is that great. Those folks then go on to become the sort of workforce or the soldiers who then sort of man this global empire, including the United States, and they're happy to be part of this imperial liberal project. The folks in New York City, just to ground it again, are very, very happy. One of the reasons why I think that New York is a better lens for this is they're very, very happy to be part of this British project. There are, even the folks who then go on to become, there's virtually no difference between the loyalists. Again, we've been sort of, if we focus on the ideology too much and what's sort of stated, you get the sense of this hard difference between the loyalists and the patriots. It's almost indistinguishable, the ideology between those two, up until we get to the only reason really there's this sharp polarization when the revolution comes about is because independence cleaves this general rebellion against British policy, right? And that British policy, again, to sort of round out that little note that I started before, they create this big empire and they have a staggering amount of debt, and then they start basically restricting the colonial economy. And that's the day-to-day reality that drives people to rebel against what's going on. I doubt that the average person in America, in New York City or in any of those port cities, which are the first to organize and rebel against those British policies and give us the American Revolution, the people that are actually out there fighting and dying, right, were engaged all too much with these debates about the theories of the Enlightenment, right? What they knew was that the streets of New York City were full of paupers, that the workhouses were bursting at the seams, that the British Royal Navy, right, which literally dragged people from their homes or from their beds, or the bars on the street if you were a little bit too inebriated, right, to go serve on these ships for years or decades at a time to go conquer other lands. So, you know, what does that freedom look like? And to the question of imperialism, which we do this horrible thing in history where we constantly cleave domestic and foreign policy, and it's totally nonsensical. These two things are totally interdependent. And I profoundly agree with you that there's this anti-war tradition on the left and the right and the center from the beginning of this country. But you know, what has to be said too, I think, is that I don't think that there's some sort of Edenic fall from a sort of golden age. You know, the most, and you're probably aware of this from your background, but the most comprehensive data set we have on this is the Military Intervention Project. I think it's run out of Brown. I'm not quite sure. I might be confusing it with the Cost of Wars Project. But there was a great book that came out based on this research a couple of years ago called Dying by the Sword. A couple of scholars paired up and published with Oxford. You know, since 1776 alone, which we rather arbitrarily declare our founding date, I would say, over 400 foreign military interventions this country is engaged in, right? And that's not counting the drone wars, and it's not counting the quote-unquote frontier wars against over 100 Native American countries, right? And if you include the 150 years or so before 76, right, when the colonists are quite engaged in foreign interventions, right? I mean, we're born imperialists from the beginning.
But were the majority of them after World War II, like when they...
The most militarized period is the Cold War, after World War II. But it's not by much. So the late 1800s, which we don't think of as a very particularly militaristic period, is. And again, in part because we just take for granted that, you know, the imperialism is focused on this continent, right? I mean, the speed by which the American, you know, this sort of world historic event, the first liberal nation, to use an older phrase, you know, the speed by which we imperialize North America is breathtaking in world historical terms, right? And as soon as that frontier is closed, we then go overseas, right? And we have what, a dozen colonies between 1898 and the end of World War II.
Yeah, that's that Roosevelt corollary.
And Roosevelt is one of those very few periods. It's FDR. And it's Jimmy Carter for a couple of years anyway, that are really the sort of only really kind of non-militaristic years in our history. I mean, you know, and I would say that those two things are, you know, liberalism. You know, we have a ton of we have almost nothing by way of really of literature about the Industrial Revolution in America. And I make that point to say, you know, liberalism and capitalism are indistinguishable. We have a ton of literature on, say, the English Industrial Revolution, but so much of it is focused on the sort of later period, we sort of jump in media res. This question of where liberalism comes from, I don't know. That's beyond my bailiwick. But I think we're probably, you know, eager to jump into the Q&A conversation portion of this conversation. But I would just say that the question is, was it liberal? I think undeniably. What that meant for the average person on the ground, in terms of their motivation to engage in the revolution, or in terms of the results of the revolution, is a very different thing. I think that one of the more interesting questions that we should ask, and we don't ask ourselves this enough as scholars, is how does this come about? You know, I was reading because we take it for granted. We are so just profoundly liberal in our thought, right? Across the spectrum, right? I'm just astounded at sort of the liberal assumptions that go into left-wing thought, for example, sometimes. And we talk about left and right and such, but the modern age is a profoundly liberal one. And I would say that at the most sort of basic assumption, it is this sort of teleological sort of view that we have of history. This notion that just one day we woke up and we had these ideas, hey, liberty would be great. That's just not, I think, the way that happened. Tim Mitchell in his book Carbon Democracy a few years ago made the point that there's this we don't talk to each other across the disciplines or even within the disciplines. So among historians, the modernists don't talk to the medievalists or the ancients. And then we just wipe out like 99% of history that we call anthropology. And pretend as if like Rome represented the majority of mankind, or even that I think that some like folks that are not living in civilizations, right, or living under basically state rule, are a majority up until 1500, 1600. Do those people not live with freedom and liberty? According to the imperialists, they don't. Well, I'm just rambling on, and I'm sorry, but I'll just to the second point of the question. I do think to the point of its meeting today, since there was a lot of talk about sort of some referencing to that. So, I think that the American Revolution is this, and the creation of these liberal democracies comes about from these sort of material conditions that, for whatever reason, sort of give us this modern liberal order. And I think that the crisis that we find ourselves in today is very obviously from the same sort of development. It's not just here, obviously. It's in across the economic world. This is again another sort of profoundly liberal thing that we take for granted across the spectrum. We had this notion that it's very much of this notion between the old world and the new world, that just by power of our ideas that we were going to be able to create these civilizations that will go forever. That's not the age we live in. We are living in this age of insane denial about the crisis that we face. And the crisis that we face is not Trumpism or MAGAism or the far right or things like that. I mean, those are bad crises. But the real crises that we face is planetary boundaries. This notion that we've built an entire global civilization that we imagine can just go on forever, and we live in this absurdity, that we can just, with a few windmills or solar panels, continue this story forever. That climate change is just climate change is just one among a dozen of these planetary boundaries that we're exceeding, which the solar panels and the windmills will not address. We are living in an insane moment in which liberalism, Fukuyama thought our big problem was going to be that we were going to be bored. The big problem is that we have grown the existential risks to civilization and humankind itself, from nuclear war to now a dozen potentialities. So, yes, we were born liberal, and that is a big problem.
Erin, I saw you were jumping in at one point. If there was something pressing in somebody else's remarks that you want to remark on before we go into questions?
Maybe just to something that Peter said, if that's all right, which is about the question of like thought and reality. The question of thought and reality. And I think, and maybe it didn't come through, but the point I was trying to make is that liberalism is a reflection on a new social reality, right? So the ideas don't come first, the social reality comes first. And I think that, with the American Revolution, people tend to make the same mistake, as in there's an overemphasis on the political aspect of the revolution and an underemphasis on the social aspect of the revolution, which I take to be what James was kind of trying to point to in terms of the freedom of labor being kind of the deep origin of the American Revolution in Europe. I mean, you could say that it's not just the poor and the dispossessed, though of course it is, and the people who are in debt who flee to America, but it's all sorts of people who are discontented with old forms of life that they think are, obnoxious to their own individual freedoms who come to America. And so it does become a sort of way of dissenting from what had existed. I mean, I guess the other thing I would maybe want to pose is that, this sort of materialism in philosophy, which is a much abused word, obviously. But okay, nevertheless, what was that about, and why did the liberal thinkers have it? It was about trying to understand human social life in its own terms. So can we make sense of the meaning of our social activity, which happens anyway and happens for all sorts of personal reasons? And, in terms of the Industrial Revolution, I think part of the reason that for Marx socialism becomes so important is because socialism is a sort of self-understanding of the Industrial Revolution, right? Like Robert Owen is thinking about how what's been created by the freedom of labor that's been kind of unleashed by the political freedom that came in the late 18th century. Is reshaping the world, right? You can have like the introduction of a machine and suddenly all of social life has changed and all of your social institutions can come into crisis. And could we transform ourselves through sort of conscious action, right? And so socialism is a sort of self-understanding of the Industrial Revolution as it's kind of coming into its own in the early 19th century. I would say that's a little bit, it's not quite like capitalism and the Industrial Revolution aren't really, it's a bit of a different problem from what liberalism was facing. And that's kind of part of what I was trying to think about is how, there was the question of sovereignty and whether popular sovereignty can actually be free to act in the world. And that America seemed to say, okay, yes, it is. And I don't know, maybe we'll get here in the discussion, but this comes into a sort of crisis in the 1830s. And that's when you get Marxism and socialism and these sorts of ideas, communism, but also you get a crisis of liberalism. That liberalism is actually not able to continue in its own terms. And I think that's what we live in today, right? Like in a sense, I know that, we've been through like 20 years of neoliberalism's the worst, and liberalism is just a way of alibying like specific types of neoliberal policy. But in a way, neoliberalism is actually the crisis of these liberal ideas. And I just thought, well, we shouldn't take this for granted. Like it can be actually useful for us to think about that as a problem, because I think many people think, okay, liberalism is a set of values, and it's like a bad set of values that leads to bad outcomes, and we have to be against it. I mean, the difficult thing that Constant makes you think about is all the things that dominate us are the result of our own freedom, right? All these things that we think are like the limits of nature and the limits of the earth are actually the result of our own social freedom that we just can't recognize. Anyway, I'm sorry, I've spoken too much, but no, thanks for your comments.
Questions?
Yeah, thanks, guys. So what I wanted to really harp on was what you brought up, Kelley, that foreign policy and domestic policy are two sides of the same coin. They always have been. I think James's presentation kind of, brought us back to the founding moment of why that's the case. And I also want to bring up your presentation, Stephen, where you talk about basically how American life seems to be getting duller and, for lack of a better word, less awesome. And I would say that in the 20th century, in the Cold War, there was this real appeal to America as still a land of awesomeness and freedom and inspiration for the world over. And what seems to be happening now, it's this sort of post-liberal thing, or people who are reaching for tradition or dissatisfied with this American image of inspiration to the rest of the world, is that they're shirking away from liberalism as a good thing to continue building on, or something that the world is jealous of or wants, right? And a lot of this has to do with the end of the Soviet Union, obviously. And then also sort of cynicism generated by the failed, protracted Mideast wars. So what I want to ask you guys is, what is liberalism still this source of like inspiration and awesomeness to the world? And how does that relate to the sort of problem we're working through where, America has to serve as an inspiration for this global civilization that we're building, as the most free element of that global civilization, but also seems to be like, critical or of its own role in that, or I guess I would say like, producing, these discontents that you brought up, Stephen, where it's like, okay, we can't like keep this project together that sustained us through the Cold War, and now it's just like unclear what this American creed or value is. So I just want to ask about like, how does liberalism make American life attractive in a way that would continue to allow the world to participate in this global American civil social project that E. James had laid out?
And the first thing that comes to mind is the problem of air conditioning, which we had to deal with a couple of minutes ago. So I've gone on several tirades about the evils of excessive air conditioning because I think it's emblematic of everything that we're talking about now. Because
What's the problem?
air conditioning is evil. That's the problem.
I shut the air conditioning off.
No.
You want the air conditioning?
No. I'm
Thank you.
sorry. It's a metaphor, so we're good. We're
Very
good,
grateful
we're
for
good.
that.
Thank you to the staff for taking care of it. No, but
Blame the inventor.
I'll blame you guys too. We'll put you on the shit list. So no, my problem with air conditioning is this. Given because my roots are Mediterranean, so I'm kind of used to like the warm climate. No, it's this idea that, okay, we can control reality, we can manipulate the different factors of daily life in order to make it more comfortable, more convenient for us. And ultimately, yes, like this is a good thing. Like I don't like to be sitting in a hot room sweltering and, passing out from the heat. But why is it that when you go down, okay, like if I go down to the subway now, on the platform, it's going to be really hot because you're underground. When I get into the subway, it's going to be an ice box. So I go from sweating to like shivering and about to get pneumonia in this overly air-conditioned subway car. Why do we do that? Like, why don't we just say, okay, let's put on some like moderate air conditioning so that we're not dying of heat? I think this is part and parcel of this idea that like, well, we're free to use more and more air conditioning. If air conditioning makes life more comfortable and easier, let's just... With 1776, because it's this idea that if we're more free, if we have freedom to make life easier, to make it better for everybody, we should do it. We should go all the way. My issue with liberalism, and again, this particular American brand of freedom that I think the liberal project has led us to, is that people aren't actually happy. We're told that, yeah, if I buy more things, if I use more comforts like air conditioning, everything's going to be better. Now, am I right to say that the American Revolution, that liberalism led us to this point where like we're using things to excess, we're consuming things we don't need, and we're all actually miserable and unhappy? I'm inclined to say yes, there is a link. Maybe I'm being an extremist, I acknowledge that. But anyway, my biggest concern is that, again, we're sold this narrative that freedom, the freedom to consume and use more things, will make us happy. I don't see people very happy. And to your question about like, okay, like the global expansion of this notion of freedom, like I see it in other countries. Like I see, again, like going back to visit family in Italy where, yeah, they tend to, in the past, I wouldn't see people using air conditioning that much. They would have fans that have open windows. Now I see that. And it's dissatisfying. It's disappointing. The last thing I'll say before I pass it to Kelley is like, when you're saying about this kind of traditionalist reaction to, the excesses of American liberalism, I think there's something, I don't know, like there's a cognitive dissonance here. I would say in both the traditional, like you see these, like these trad Catholic converts, you see, other iterations of young people trying to retrieve something from the past. But I also think like the like peak 2020 woke as social justice warrior critique of America being a land of, evil colonizers. I think like it's interesting because both of these kind of trends recognize, okay, there is something dissatisfying and also morally concerning about what's become of this ideal of American freedom, born of liberalism. But these kind of, I don't know, like these niche identities, these kinds of social movements would not be possible without liberalism. Like, that's the kind of cognitive dissonance here. And ultimately, I don't think the trads or the SJWs are actually countering the problems, the real problems that they see in liberalism. They just are kind of putting on this performance, which social media is very conducive to. So I don't know, that starts to, yeah.
The whole panel once more sharply. Did the inability of the U.S. military to spread liberalism to other countries in the Middle East wars, like, are we on a long hangover from that? The whole concept of liberalism and its world inheritance of it from America.
You mean the inability to spread political liberalism or economic liberalism? Because economic liberalism is the reality across the world with all these different political forms of government that we have, right? I don't have to, we were chatting before about a friend we have sharing in common, and I was just reading his book the other day, where he went through, was it Paul Bremer, who was the guy in charge and Bremer was by all accounts seemingly like a true believer. Like he wasn't a person who was cynical about this notion of spreading political liberalism there. Do I think that that's how we got to Iraq? No. But let's say that it is. Do we? The net result of I profoundly agree with you actually that we shouldn't take for granted what Marx said, right, that liberalism was this profound event in world history, right, the break for at least for those societies that lived under state rule, right, it is this advance. And we can't sort of think about socialism or any of these other things except as crises that come about because of the limits of liberalism that then sort of expand the notions and values that we have today, right? But the net result of the spread of liberalism, economic liberalism around the world, has not been a dramatic expansion, I would say, of political liberty. And I think that is kind of baked into the system. Maybe that's too, it's cynical for this room, but I don't think that those two things are coincident.
I think what we're looking at here, I think that I don't think the project itself is dead. I think that the progressivism, this idea that we could impose our values and spread democracy over the globe, was the limit. And why? Is because we forgot about free will and we forgot about sovereignty. So when you look at all of the interventions, when you look at the regime change wars, what's the thread line? The thread line is that they were imposed from the outside. And whether it be Iraq, Libya, even Ukraine, all of these color revolutions, the only successes that they ended up having, if they did, were when it was organic. When we try to impose our values through these wars, they fail time and again. And you can look at Vietnam is like one of the best examples. We spent how many years there thinking that we were going to end communism, that the people in South Vietnam would not be able to achieve their goals against the North without our assistance, all the way up through the global war on terror. And I bring up Ukraine because that's a perfect example of the humanitarian or liberal intervention that was propelled by Victoria Nuland and Hillary Clinton. They're coming from the Democratic side of the neoconservative project, so to speak, where they felt like infusing, the activists on the ground with American money and with these USAID democracy projects would somehow overturn the Russian-influenced government there. It was a disaster. And what do we see now? We see a war that we can't end. We're trying to end it. NATO is trying to end it. So I think liberalism itself, grounded in free will and sovereignty, and to scale with locality, because that's what the founders had envisioned. They did not envision this centralized government in Washington that would grow and metastasize. And a lot of it was because of progressivism and all the wonderful things that progressivism brought us with the end of slavery and labor rights and women's rights and suffrage and all that, has ended up growing a government that became tyrannical, high on its own power, and tried to project outwards. And I think that's where it all went astray.
Can I just briefly jump on that? Just, liberalism spreads around the world, I would say principally because of the British Empire, right? And then we succeed as the first truly world hegemonic power. And then we succeed as the second, right? And it's counterposed for the longest time by the Soviet Union and the communist world, right? Which I think is part of the reason why you see decolonization, these other things. During that period, right, which we attribute to the rise of liberalism, the United States is engaged in 2.5 coups every single year. And they're not to impose democracy. They're to destabilize democracy, right? We're propping up tons and tons and tons of right-wing authoritarian regimes. So do with that what you will.
I don't think liberalism is imposed by America or by the British Empire at all. I think if you take from a classical Marxist perspective, it is the revolutionary practical idealism of daily life in bourgeois society. Insofar as the world becomes based on the universal commodity form, that is, the universal exchange of labor and its products, liberalism becomes the fundamental way of thinking about daily life in the world. It's inescapable. So despite whatever of the failures of America's forever wars, liberal aspirations and demands are never going away. They have been at the heart of global bourgeois society since its emergence in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries in the westernmost part of Eurasia, and now its global spread. People are going to make liberal demands. I know we live in a kind of nonsense time, right, where you get people like John Mearsheimer in foreign policy and, post-liberals like Deneen saying this is all a kind of, delusional ideology being spread upon the world. No, it is generated by people's daily relations in everyday life. Liberalism simply is the coming into full self-consciousness of how people interact in a world of the universal exchange of free labor and its products, of having to freely associate and assemble, of having to freely set the course of their own lives. And liberalism is generated by that. It's the inescapable horizon of modern society. It's not imposed by any coercive power. It will be there irrespective of whether the United States rises or falls in the future. Those demands and aspirations exist, and I think it's the project of any critical left to have to say, why are those demands and aspirations continuously failed to be realized? Not just in the world where liberalism only ever came in crisis, like Iran. Bourgeois society only arose in Iran when it was already in contradiction and crisis. Even in the United States, where it had its, deepest, as it were, was most entrenched in the soil, it's in contradiction and crisis. And so I just think the liberal demands and aspirations are the ineluctable horizon of modern life. And they cannot be possibly fulfilled without also being overcome, as Erin was talking about, by socialism. The problem contra the post-liberals is not liberalism. The problem is capitalism. Capitalism generates the nihilism that we confront today. There is not a crisis of meaning that began with Jordan Peterson telling you there was a crisis of meaning. It began in the 19th century, and Soren Kierkegaard and Nietzsche were all talking about it, and they were doing it in a much more profound form than these people today. We have been in a crisis of meaning in that sense since the 19th century. We have been in a world that yearns for post-liberalism, that is, post-capitalism, since the 19th century. But we can't try and dismiss liberalism as an illusion, as a coercive project, as something imposed from without. It's not what the post-liberals say. It's not what the post-colonials say. It's not what the post-structuralists say. It is not a delusion. It's generated by daily life in bourgeois society. It is an aspiration that is generated but is blocked by the capitalist mode of production, and it's only by confronting and trying to transform the capitalist mode of production of our interactions with each other and nature that we can possibly even begin to imagine a post-liberal world that would be both a fulfillment of liberalism but also go beyond liberalism.
Oh.
It's not live.
Okay, just real quick on this
okay.
discussion, I would like to maybe come in with a point of clarification about the British Empire since it's come up, because I think this is actually an important point because, today we look back in history and we see that basically what looks like the first interventionism comes from the British Empire, right? And so the British Empire seems like a sort of model on which current American, really 20th century American, like global policing is based on. And I do think it's important that this really is the Britain of like the mid to the late 19th century. And it's like the Britain of Lord Palmerston, right? This is like the beginning of gunboat diplomacy in the 1850s. And, it's like, okay, what's going on there? Is Britain trying to like impose its political ideals on the rest of the world? The way they would have understood it is that they're kind of forced into these situations to protect like the social interest in these places. Okay, and why is this happening? Well, it's one way of describing it is, you get the expansion of the franchise in Britain with the Great Reform Bill in 1830. And this makes Britain a modern democratic nation and a very, bourgeois democratic nation much closer to America for the first time. And this happens at the same time and is part of and related to a social crisis that's unfolding because of the Industrial Revolution, which is, it's at the same time as the expansion of prisons, poverty, mass unemployment for the first time. And so the new kind of liberal government attempts to manage this through things like the workhouses, the modern workhouses. The state is expanded for the first time in the 1830s, and you see the emergence of working class politics in the 1830s as well. And this is related to the discontents with liberal rule that are happening in France under the July monarchy. And this sort of liberal democratic management of social crisis is being exported into Algeria through the Algiers Wars, but also through the British Empire starting in 1833 with the end of the East India Company monopoly and the abolition of slavery within the British Empire. What you see is that all of these liberal reformers think, okay, we have our problem in Britain, it's this social problem with the working class, and we can go and we can apply this to people around the world, and our commodities are going this way, right? We're gonna sell all these goods to the rest of the world, and maybe that will help us with our social crisis at home. And when the 1848 revolution happens, which is the first socialist revolution and also the first kind of failed revolutions around the world, Britain suppresses working class politics inside, and in fact oversees the management of the crisis of 1848 around the world. And they do this in Turkey, they do it in India, they do it even in China in a way. So it's a social problem that seems to demand the state come in and impose authoritarian or other despotic measures. Sometimes it looks like, like in China, what it looks like is the suppression of the Taiping Rebellion, and then the British prop up this like decrepit old despotic Qing dynasty. They don't actually impose liberal values. I mean, and in a way, this is what people are mad about with Iraq, is that America didn't go in and give people in Iraq American freedom. Of course not. The people of Iraq did not get a Bill of Rights, right? And a constitution that protects their, individual freedom. They got nothing like that. Instead, what seems to have happened is you export the same sort of, decrepit neoliberal democracy that everybody in America is complaining about.
Well, let's say that those liberal political ideals, right, do spread to those countries, right? Then those people, not only does it ironically kind of spur these sort of more socialistic sort of demands, but right, sort of you get people who might actually start talking about like, well, hey, maybe we should actually be charging higher prices for these goods that are being consumed in the West, right? That's not what the West wants. which is how we get to those scenarios. And the account that I've read is there's something like 250 of these sort of suppressions of armor rebellions just in the late 1800s alone, that period of the second global British Empire, right? And it is very synonymous with, and Julian Go's book, Patterns of Empire, is kind of great on this. Constant regime change by the British, it's very synonymous with what you see in America during the Cold War era, right? I mean, where right from the beginning with Truman's resources report, right? Where they're rather nakedly sort of saying yeah, we don't want democracy to spread to the colonies because actually the colonies is where we get all of our primary materials, very cheap goods, right? Which is
But it is a problem in these places, the kind of crisis of capitalism doesn't give rise to socialist politics. Like in China, the Taiping are Christian fascists. They are just killing people for smoking opium. So there's a social problem too. It's okay, well, should the British Empire have let the Taiping take over China? It's well, maybe there's a task actually to organize society so that the forms of reaction to capitalism, right, don't take the form of some crazed millenarian Christian fascism or something else. But I think part of what is important is that the social problems in England are not separate from the social problems in these places, which is always, this is my only issue with they're going to adopt state socialism and say that they want to charge higher goods. And it's well, but then there's also a shared interest actually between the workers in England and in, India, or the workers in America and in these places. And in fact, their conditions of freedom affect each other. But this is the whole point with China. It's that low wages in China keep the wages in America low, right? So there's a social relationship.
Someone who has a question.
Sure, sorry. Yes, please.
I just wanted to follow up on what you and the other gentlemen said before. I think that we've strayed perhaps here, at least, or maybe the scope of the topic was intended to be so broad, because it says it's the American Revolution liberal, and you proceeded to describe a population of criminals and certain what I think are not incomplete and simplistic explanations as to how the revolution actually succeeded. There are several factors that really should not be overlooked. By the way, who was the first president to explicitly suppress the First Amendment? Theodore Roosevelt in 1902. He was followed by Wilson, a Roosevelt by a Democrat with the infamous Committee on Public Information. Codification, not invention. This was as true at Runnymede as it is with the Code of Hammurabi, right? Lord Coke, in the late 17th century, I believe it was, in his writings on equity and law, spoke of ancient liberties, right? Okay. Some of the settlement of what would become the United States of America was not just the, quote, lower classes. How about the Huguenot Walloon who were forced out and barely survived after the Edict of Nantes? You also had another factor. You had certain entities or parties, groups dissatisfied in the peership after the English Civil War, and some of those were key to motivation. There was the only peer who had an estate in the New World, Lord Fairfax. And Lord Fairfax had an apprentice, a young apprentice surveyor named George Washington. The British Empire, once they discovered the enormous price of what they thought would be a quick and easy put-down, because they employed Hessians. Why did they employ Hessians? They were in a world war, or at least a quasi-world war. They were at least on two fronts. And India was the greater prize at the time. And that does not necessarily specify the influence in that context of private enterprises masquerading as quasi-public interests, such as, of course, the East India Tea Company. Lastly, I'd like to point out that after the Revolution, some of the very mercenaries that were the basis of such expensive war, the Hessians, almost a third of the approximately 16,000 deployed by the British Empire to try to put down the colonials here, continentals as they were called. Almost 5,000 chose to stay here. Why? Liberalism may provide an answer. And what passes for liberalism these days is frankly rather libertine. By the way, I've seen other names much more recent, but in the Anglophone world, I thought it was Edmund Burke who was supposed to be one of the founders of conservatism. Thank you. Thank you.
I have an actual question to ask as opposed to monologue. So I just thought, I was thinking of the phrase freedom, and I was thinking of a title of a book called Beyond Good and Evil. And so I wanted to kind of push on this point about like freedom versus happiness. And maybe this goes to this question about the American Revolution as liberal, and maybe what Erin was bringing about liberalism as a reflection of conditions, which is maybe, I don't know, maybe the American Revolution continues, and maybe it even looks bad to us today, and this kind of goes to the capitalism point, but because of how it's posing this question of freedom. And even in the 18th century, they knew to the degree that freedom imposed itself as a task on us, to the degree that we didn't rise to it, it was worse than us ever leaving the state of nature. That's probably the way they would have put it. So to all the panelists, I guess I would really like you to respond to that, because I even saw maybe a little disagreement about the freedom versus happiness thing, but isn't freedom beyond such? And didn't Thomas Jefferson know this when he was saying, whatever's happening in France, this is the necessity of freedom? And this is why we might have to support it to its end.
I can say something, just because, I was thinking about this, I guess the other guy said something about how freedom now is libertine. I don't know what's bad about being libertine, but it made me think of the, road stuff and the air conditioner. Also because I'm from the land of air conditioner and roads. I'm from Texas. So I can tell you, my husband's about to become an American citizen. He's from Ecuador. And the first time I took him to visit my family in Dallas, which is the ultimate strip mall, his favorite part of Dallas was going inside of an In-N-Out burger on the 4th of July, because it was filled with high school students, and everybody working there was a high schooler, and they were all singing. While they were working, they were singing because they're all friends. And then he took a fry and he dipped it in a milkshake. And he's like, Erin, I think this is the American dream. And of course, the air conditioning was blasting because it was 90 degrees out. So, but it raises this question, I guess, about also whether liberalism or freedom is a cultural form, right? Is it a cultural form that you want to identify with, and then it's imposed on other people, and it's bad because they may have another cultural form, maybe the Texans want air conditioners, but the Italians don't, and right? And I've been told that people in China really like air conditioners, and they air condition the outside, the street, which is something we don't do in Texas, so maybe there's that form too. Or what that's about. And I just wondered if you had a thought about why it is that this seems to be a problem. I mean, I guess people think it's depoliticizing, that if we had more kind of political freedom, then we'd be able to determine our values, and that it's maybe more shallow, that people find happiness or fulfillment in the small pleasures and niceties of life. But it does make me think about Constant, because part of why I thought that his criticism of Rousseau was interesting was that he was trying to think about how, by creating that sovereign political power, we do create a power that can dominate us if we're not conscious of its proper ends. And so how do we understand those ends, and why kind of the cultural aspect? Are those ends cultural, or are they something else? I feel like this relates to the question. Yeah.
I quickly want to respond to, I guess the crux of the question about the difference between freedom and happiness, freedom and pursuit of meaning. Because, this is why I'm so conflicted. Because on paper, sure, the original founding idea that, people should be free to pursue happiness in the way that they see fit which could involve, whatever religion that they choose or something else. Could be family, could be singing In-N-Out burgers. Again, it's a great idea. I like that I'm free to pursue freedom in the way that I see fit. To pursue happiness in the way that I see fit. But again, my bigger question is that even possible? Is it really possible to have a society that is neutral when it comes to the question of what actually makes human beings happy? What is objectively meaningful? No, I don't want to live in a Catholic trad integralist monarchy where they all force us to believe certain things. I don't, and these, and this is the problem with I don't know, the anachronism of this kind of position. It's not possible to return to the past. We're living in the present moment. But again, my fear is that when we propagate a government that claims to be neutral when it comes to the question of what makes human beings happy, what is meaningful, my fear is that the people who end up coming into power start to impose an answer to that question, start to impose that, yes, it's consuming more and more goods, it's consuming more commodities and whatever it may be. So again, back to the original question about freedom versus happiness. I don't think it's easy to come down with a definitive answer, but I do think we can't afford to be naive about the fact that, if we don't have a clear definition of the good, it's very easy for people in power to impose one. So again, we can be going to In-N-Out and maybe we do feel genuinely happy, but then my fear becomes okay, but who, I don't know, back to this question of centralization. Why is it that this big company that has, franchises all around the US, why aren't we going to the mom and pop? What happened to that? That becomes my big concern. I feel like liberalism engenders this kind of big corporate kind of overreach that at the end of the day is not going to make people happy. But again, I don't have an answer. I'm happy that the kids were singing in In-N-Out at the end of the day.
Danny, to kind of answer your question. Revolutionary liberalism or the Enlightenment inverts the biblical injunction in the Gospel of John that ye shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free. It says, no, the truth is that you are free, right? That is free to individually and collectively set the course of your own existence. And this seems to enter into a world of nihilism and relativism where just everybody's seeking their own truth and creates this kind of monstrous liberal civilization of which America is the arch representative that just is going to eventually shove Levi jeans and Big Macs down everybody's throat. Okay, the point though of revolutionary liberalism was that if everybody can set the course of their own existence and find their calling and what they're good at and enter into a freely determined social division of labor and a universal market society, you would massively increase the productivity of human beings and massively increase the goods and services on offer, and over time reduce their labor time and increase their leisure time, and not destroy traditions, not destroy religion, not destroy the truth, not destroy meaning, but actually collectively and individually in our free time with our family, our friends, our loved ones, in that realm of freedom, one from the realm of necessity, we would come to actually embrace a whole different range of meanings and possibilities, and maybe some people will live traditionally, right? I think we should take seriously Locke's view that it's only with universal emancipation that Christianity is really Christianity. For the previous, 1700 years, it had actually been Christendom. It had been a good imposed upon people. Whereas Locke says with religious freedom, you can have genuine Christianity as faith, because you can come to it as a faith that you yourself give to yourself through the inner persuasion of your mind, instead of something imposed upon you from without. And as Locke says, we don't know. All of those peoples in the churches of the Middle Ages could be atheists, right? It could seem, because none of them have actually thought and agreed to that being the good, right? They could all have been atheists. Their asses had to be in the seats on Sunday, right? They weren't freely there. Therefore, you don't know if there are any genuine Christians in the Middle Ages, the way you can say somebody is genuinely a Christian today. Now, the capitalist mode of production, by proletarianizing society and rendering free labor dispensable and disposable, and making it not simply that there are tons of unemployed slum dwellers the world over, but even people in gainful employment today live precariously and threats to their existence. That possibility of liberalism is a leisure time where we individually and collectively went through the world's traditions and meanings and religions and thought about, how do we want to live our existence? So I just want to conclude by saying liberalism is not the enemy of tradition or religion or culture or anything like that. It's the opening up of them as a possible range of free choice that we can benefit from free social cooperation with one another without having to share the ends of human existence. And if we get our social cooperation right, we can reduce all of our labor time, increase all of our leisure time, and then we can freely set the course of our own existence, the values we want to live by. And some people will be tradcaths, and some people will be whatever, hedonists of any sort or other. But that's liberalism's insight. And I think socialism is premised on preserving that insight, on the idea that we can still create a society that reduces labor for everybody, opens up leisure to everyone, and brings that inheritance of the world traditions and religions and cultures available to all to choose the values and the ends they want to give themselves in life and not impose it on others. There can be many different ways of being human in the world, and therefore many different ways of pursuing the good. And that's why I think ultimately socialism has to inherit liberalism and the American Revolution's commitment to the free pursuit of happiness, as opposed to prior agreement on what happiness is and then imposing it on people.
Ma'am?
Okay, I'm Nita Renfrew, and I'm a former journalist. And Sublation Media has just published my book on the constitutional militia movement in the 90s, which was a true grassroots movement of we the people who studied the Constitution and so on. And my observation here is that most of the language that's being used is sort of European-type language, and even the word liberal, the word liberal turns most people off now. It's a word that never came up with the militia movement in the 90s. It's been, turned into something that's, I don't know, maybe for academics or something. But I also, before I wrote the book on the militia movement, I had close relations with the revolutionary leaders in Central America and in the Middle East. And I have to say that, in Nicaragua and Iran and the Palestinians and the Salvadorans and the Panamanians who were anti-Noriega and so on, they all admired the American Revolution and the Constitution, and they particularly liked the idea of federalism, and that was one of the things that Khomeini had promised the tribes in Iran. This never comes out, and that's why they supported him, and then he turned against them and started killing off their leaders. But it's like if you started talking to these people about liberalism and so on, they would just say, well, maybe we don't admire United States and everything. And a lot of the people who came here from those countries 20, 30 years ago, like the Mexican workers and so on, and I grew up in Mexico, so I'm bicultural, I speak to these people. They came here because they knew about the Constitution and freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and so on. We like to talk about it as if they came here for, because there were more work opportunities. Well, that was one thing. But if you talk to them about the Constitution and so on, they know more about it than most Americans do, because in the schools in this country, they stopped teaching the Constitution, I believe, as a result of the constitutional militia movement in the 90s, which they were able to put down because of all the technology and so on. So I would advise that we get away from talking all this European-type thought and using words like liberalism and so on. We need to talk about we the people, and the militia movement was made up of truck drivers and plumbers and so on. They weren't no academics, but they had all learned about the Constitution in school, in high school. They weren't college graduates. And so they hadn't learned all of this European type speech. And that's how we need to talk to the people in this country. And I'm one of the we the people. Thank you.
All right, let's give a round for our panelists. Okay, take 2 to 3 minutes, go grab some food, some coffee, and then we are going to have a reading of George Washington's 3 prophecies.